Hi, I'm Dr. Peter Tolosano, Director of Psychological Services for the Connecticut Department of Developmental Services. Welcome to our video on understanding intellectual disability. I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Dr. Tracy Sondick.
Thanks, Peter. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Dr. Tracy Sondick. I am the Director of the Behavioral Intervention Service at Connecticut Valley Hospital, which is part of the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services.
Tracy and I have presented together on this topic for many years, and we've also published together in the area of positive behavior supports. This video on understanding intellectual disability is intended for caregivers, family members, and providers.
And we're excited because this is part of a three-part series. So our presentation today is Understanding Intellectual Disability. The second presentation is Understanding the Autism Spectrum Disorder, along with our colleague Jennifer Crome. And then our third presentation is on positive behavioral support plans.
Before we can understand intellectual disability, it's good to understand general intellectual functioning. Intelligence can be defined as a broad sense of an individual's capacity to process information and solve problems. A term that's oftentimes used is IQ, or intelligence quotient. It is a way to operationalize intelligence. An IQ score is a ratio of a person's test performance or mental age as compared to their chronological age. However, it's important to note that what is measured by IQ testing does not always encompass all of one's intelligence. For example, Gartner had a theory in the early 1980s, which many people espoused to, that said people have intelligence in a variety of areas. These could be linguistic, mathematical, spatial, emotional, artistic, and interpersonal. One of the things that we also see with intellectual disability is something called splinter skills, where a person can have pockets of average or normal intellectual functioning amid other areas of impairment. On the next screen, we have the bell curve, which is another method of understanding general intellectual functioning. We can see that at the center of the curve, there's a greater number of areas versus those on the tails or ends of the curve where there's fewer space. IQ average is 100, and the units of measurement are called standard deviations, which fall at 15-point intervals. So scores between 85 and 115, plus or minus one standard deviation from the average, is the low average to high average range. The next screen also shows a bell curve, and it goes farther into understanding intellectual disability. It shows where intellectual disability falls on the left side of the curve, and it also gives us the idea of percentile rank. And one way to understand percentile rank is imagining a line at the grocery store where number 100 is at the front of the line and number 1 is at the rear of the line. Intellectual disability would fall at the second or lower percentile rank. The next slide gets further into understanding intellectual disability. As you can see on the left side of the screen, there are degrees of severity within intellectual disability. About 85% of individuals who carry the diagnosis have mild intellectual disability, which is scores from 55 to 70. Moderate intellectual disability, which is about 10%, with scores from 40 to 55. And then the last 5% is comprised of individuals diagnosed with severe and profound intellectual disability. At the lower areas of functioning, it is much more difficult to determine differences between those areas because the IQ tests typically don't have that level of sensitivity with folks who have greater level of compromise. As the slide shows, intellectual and developmental disability is noted to have about 250 syndromal and non-syndromal causes. About 25% of those are syndromal, meaning diagnoses like Down syndrome, Angelman syndrome, and Cornelia de Lange syndrome. Non-syndromal causes are typically things that happened around the time of birth. For example, someone being deprived of oxygen or something happening during the gestational period. An important note is the difference between the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the Connecticut General Statutes diagnoses of intellectual disability. The DSM diagnosis involves intellectual and adaptive deficits of an IQ score of 70 or below with a standard error measure of plus or minus 5 points that occurred during the developmental period from birth to 18 years old. If you notice, the Connecticut General Statutes definition is similar but different. To qualify for an intellectual disability under the statutes, the criteria is a significant limitation in intellectual functioning, meaning a valid full-scale IQ score of 69 or below, with concurrent deficits in adaptive functioning that also originated during the developmental period from birth to 18 years old. If you notice, standard error measure is not included in this definition.
I'm going to spend some time now talking about intellectual functioning. As Peter described earlier, full-scale IQ scores are a total score that a person has across different multiple cognitive domains. However, participants often have different performances across different index scores. In other words, the full-scale IQ score may not explain a person's strengths and limitations. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of the index scores to have a better understanding of what makes up a full-scale IQ score. The first subtest or index that I'd like to describe is verbal comprehension. Verbal comprehension refers to a person's general understanding and reasoning skills. It's often related to a person's formal and informal education level. Language is so important in terms of our ability to organize, label, manage, and describe how we're feeling. So a person who has deficits in verbal comprehension often has significant difficulty being able to say what they want to say and have people understand what they're saying. So that can be a source of frustration when there are deficits in the verbal comprehension area. This frustration can lead to emotional challenges like depression and anxiety if a person's unable to really verbalize what they need to say to others. The second index I'd like to describe is called perceptual organization. And this relates to a person's visual spatial skills, their ability to create solutions, especially in new or novel situations. I'd like to think about the right hemisphere being linked to perceptual reasoning skills. Often people describe their creativity as coming from the right hemisphere, which makes sense when we think about perceptual organization, visual spatial skills, and being able to create in unique and novel situations.
When Tracy and I present this to a live audience, one of the things that we oftentimes ask people do as a learning exercise with regard to verbal comprehension and understanding intellectual disability is have a member of the audience tell us how they feel in terms of emotion, but excluding words that have any vowels in them, such as A, E, or O. And typically, that individual will struggle, and it shows how challenging it is to get along in the world when one cannot access language.
I'd like to take some time now to talk about two other indices that are vital in terms of understanding a person's intellectual capacity. The first is working memory. Working memory refers to a person's capacity to hold information long enough to be able to do something with that information. So the example I like to give is a person's telephone number. When someone gives you a telephone number, if we don't do something with it, repeat it, put it into our phones, write it down, the information quickly leaves. We don't remember that information. That's our working memory. It's like a holding space for information. It's related to attention and concentration, short-term memory, as I described. It also is critical in terms of a person's ability to learn new information. They have to have the information to be able to learn it, and so it's key to having strong working memory to be able to learn new skills. It's also related to planning and organization. We know that participants who have difficulty with working memory often need lots of repetition and guidance to be able to utilize information that's being provided to them. We also know that working memory is sensitive to emotional and mental health challenges. Participants that take our testing that have issues with anxiety or depression often show deficits in working memory. We also know that working memory is sensitive to trauma and to anger management. When we're in a traumatic response or we're extremely agitated, it's difficult to remember information. And finally, processing speed is the fourth index I'd like to review. Processing speed refers to the ability to efficiently and quickly take information and be able to do something with it. It's very sensitive to motivation. In other words, if we're not giving our best effort, we tend to be slower. We tend to have difficulty actually producing work at a normal rate. Processing speed can affect overall cognitive functioning. Even if a person's able to understand information and be able to store it long enough to be able to utilize it later on, if the processing speed is slowed, it is much more difficult to be able to take information and utilize it. We as a society talk very quickly. We move on quickly from one topic to the next. And if you're behind, if a person has trouble processing information quickly, then oftentimes the information is not properly encoded. So working memory and processing speed are really important in terms of understanding a person's strengths and limitations. And we'll be talking later on about how to work with people that have these deficits and then how to build in some compensatory strategies to work with those limitations.
To dovetail into what Tracy was saying, our upcoming video on positive behavioral supports will show examples of how issues may seem to be behavioral in nature, but are actually tied to difficulties with someone's cognitive underpinnings. For example, an individual diagnosed with intellectual disability might not see options in particular situations and may make them seem resistant when in actuality they simply don't understand the next thing to do to cope in a situation. Also, with regard to processing speed, oftentimes we see low processing speed pull down an individual's overall intellectual profile because it has an effect on many different areas of functioning.
And that's why understanding intellectual functioning isn't just a full-scale IQ. Sometimes overlooking the other indices, we're missing vital information that can help us really better approach working with the individual.
As the slide illustrates, the best approach to helping work with an individual who's diagnosed with intellectual disability is using assessments, intellectual assessments, to inform our interventions. In this way, we're building on the individual's cognitive strengths and minimizing their weaknesses. For example, if someone has visual spatial strengths and verbal limitations, when we interact with them, we want to provide information using pictures, signs, and gestures rather than words. This type of information is oftentimes quite valuable when developing behavioral support plans. Also, when we think about intellectual functioning in the area of developmental disabilities, one of the concerns that we oftentimes see is something called diagnostic overshadowing. And what that means is anytime an individual is having difficulties, individuals may mistakenly attribute all of their difficulties to the intellectual deficits as opposed to understanding that person in a more holistic or comprehensive way.
I'd like to speak about the brain, since underlying intellectual disabilities really is what's actually happening in the brain itself. So I'd like to describe, as you can see in the slide, a little bit about what you're seeing and the different parts of the brain. If we think about the brain in three sections, we're going to start with the brainstem, which is the lowest level, the most primitive part of our brain. From an evolutionary standpoint, we share the brainstem with all living creatures. So the brainstem controls our vital physical functions and our survival responses. Our automatic responses such as breathing and sleep regulation are all related to the brainstem. Once we travel into the deeper sections of the brain, we're in the limbic system, and the limbic system governs emotions. The limbic system is vital to understanding a person's emotional responses. The key areas when we're thinking about the limbic system are the amygdala and the hippocampus. Those two areas of the brain are vital in understanding how a person can handle stress, anger management, and being able to control their overall emotional reactivity. We have done a lot of research looking at these areas of the brain to help us understand our people that we serve and why they may have specific emotional regulation difficulties. We know that the amygdala is tied into the flight or fight response. So when we work with individuals that have significant anger management or anxiety attacks, we understand that this is often related to the amygdala, which may be firing in ways that are very difficult and overwhelming for the participant. So we'll spend some time, as Peter suggested later on, when we talk about positive behavioral support plans, to really work on emotion regulation that ties right into this key area of the brain. And the frontal lobes, which are vital in terms of a person's ability to plan, organize, sequence, and self-reflect. I want to spend a little time discussing the role of the frontal lobes and their communication value with the rest of the brain. The frontal lobes communicate with different areas of the brain and allow a person to be able to evaluate whether a situation is dangerous, anxiety-provoking, upsetting, or is a neutral stimuli, and a person can go on with what they're doing. If the frontal lobes and the connection with the limbic system are not online, in other words, they're not communicating efficiently, we often see a person respond with fight or flight behavior, poorly controlled emotions, and this can lead to significant behavioral issues. When we talk about in our later presentation around positive behavioral support planning, we often focus on working on strengthening a person's capacity to remain online with the frontal lobes and to self-regulate using different coping skills to help quiet down the firing that takes place in the amygdala, in the limbic system. The frontal lobes help us to self-monitor, help us to plan and organize, and also are key to having an empathic response, feeling another person's feelings and having a sensitivity to how other people are feeling and doing in the world. We know that that participants who have intellectual disabilities often have challenges with empathy and being able to understand how another person may be feeling or thinking.
To Tracy's point about the interplay between the limbic system and the frontal lobes, the analogy that we sometimes use is that the limbic system is like the horse and the frontal lobes are like the rider. Another way to understand it, as depicted on the slide, is that the limbic system is a low road and the frontal lobes are the high road.
In addition to looking at intellectual capacity, when we talked about the definition for intellectual disability, we spoke about adaptive functioning. Adaptive functioning is really a person's ability to function at an appropriate level for their age, right? So that's why the slide talks about age equivalence. So we're looking at a person's capacity to do certain skills that are commensurate with their age, and how effectively a person can cope with common life demands in different settings. Those settings might be home life, which might refer to a person's ability to cook, to take care of practical daily activities like taking out the garbage, making medical appointments. It also often refers to a person's ability in the workplace to be able to manage the demands that would be required to even get to work on time. And then also in terms of relationships, being able to carry out a relationship that is commensurate with one's age. So we look at three domains when we're describing adaptive functioning. We're looking at practical, skills-based; conceptual, a person's general understanding of how things work in the world; and then social skills, a person's interpersonal relatedness, their ability to verbalize, and also to be able to listen appropriately, and then also to have that empathy that we talked about earlier, the capacity to understand how someone else is feeling, and then interact appropriately based on using that empathic skill. We have specific measures that look at adaptive functioning and give us indices that give us a sense of a person's strengths and weaknesses in this domain. Typical adaptive functioning measures may include the Vineland scales and the BASC. When we utilize these measures, we're typically using a self-report, and also we're interviewing caregivers and family members to have a full understanding of a person's adaptive functioning. So we are looking at these different domains, which may include health, self-care, expressive and receptive communication. So how well can a person communicate and understand what the information is being provided to them? Social and community activities. Does the person have the ability to initiate going to the movies, attending a club, participating in a sporting activity? Independent living skills, which really requires multiple skills, a person's ability to prepare a meal, to remember to take their medication, to clean their home appropriately, to do their own self-care, which may include grooming, wearing the appropriate clothing for weather, so remembering to wear a winter coat when it's cold outside. Vocational abilities. Does the person have the capacity to work independently, or do they need coaching? Do they need someone to remind them throughout their workday to make sure that they are recalling the tasks that they need to recall? And then self-direction. Self-direction is the person's ability to direct, to be their own agent in terms of how their day goes, what responsibilities they're going to follow through with. You can see that several of these capacities are related to the previous slide around frontal lobes. So many of these domains relate to a person's strength or weakness in their frontal and executive functioning.
To Tracy's point, one of the challenges that we find when looking at scores from adaptive measures is the issue of inter-rater reliability or consistency between individuals that are informing the test scores. Oftentimes, their perception of an individual's abilities in terms of adaptive functioning is at variance, and it makes it quite difficult to understand that person accurately. One of the things that Tracy and I oftentimes do in our presentations is infuse our teaching with real-life examples. And one where adaptive functioning comes into play is an example of a young lady that I once worked with, and she had refusals to go grocery shopping with her caregivers. On the surface, it appeared to be a behavioral issue, but in actuality, the underlier was conceptual skills deficits. And the reality of what was happening was she was very afraid to go into grocery line and pay using a debit card or credit card that she was provided because she could not grasp how a card could translate into actual money to purchase something. So we hope that those type of examples help people to widen their understanding of how intellectual and adaptive deficits may affect someone's ability to cope with the world. We hope that you found this video informative. If you have any questions, please refer to the contact information on the screen.
Thank you. As always, it was a pleasure to present with you, Peter, and I look forward to our second presentation on understanding autism spectrum disorder. Thank you all.
Thank you.